10L Sports Central will be going over our next final prediction of this offseason, and it will be over the Michigan Wolverines. And this is a team that went 9-4 in 2019. All around, bit of a disappointment of a season for Michigan. Many expected them to have 10, maybe even 11 wins in the regular season. But today we're going to be going over whether or not they can reach that level in 2020 and whether or not this team can finally win their division. But we're also going to be going over a full preview and along with their returning production and a full prediction on every game on Michigan's schedule heading into the 2020 season. So with that, let's look at your season trends from 2019 for this team. Of course, they were 9-4 once again, and then they were 6-2 between September and October, and they were 3-2 between November and the postseason. So this is a pretty consistent team all season long. They didn't really have any major improvement or decline over the season. They were pretty much the same as they were all season. And I mean, Michigan last season, they had Shea Patterson, and they had a great offense in general. And you pair that with a great defense, you've got a great team. And for Michigan, that's exactly what they had last season. I mean, there's great reason to believe that Michigan could possibly finally get over that hump of Ohio State and maybe even win the division last season, but didn't really happen that way. But nonetheless, still for Michigan, I think this is a team that still has a ton of talent going into next season, and it wouldn't surprise me a single bit to see Michigan get right up to 9 wins again, and we'll be going over why in just a little bit. But yeah, some of your key wins from last season: you beat Iowa by a touchdown, 10-3. That was a home game. Then you'd play your signature win of the season against Notre Dame, 45-14. Absolutely blew out Notre Dame in that one. Then you had a big win against Michigan State, 44-10 at home. Then you beat out Indiana on the road, 39-14. And let me remind you, Indiana was not an easy team last season. I mean, they made it to a bowl game, a pretty good one for that matter. And they were able to keep up with Tennessee. So I mean, 39-14 is a great win there, especially on the road for Michigan. As far as your returning production looks, though, you lose your starting quarterback, Shea Patterson. And, of course, he's a big part of this team over the past couple of years. He's put up some decent stats. He put up over 3,000 last season with 23 touchdowns and 8 interceptions. He also had a 56% completion rate. So he was not a very accurate quarterback last season. I mean, he had definitely had a ton of potential to improve that going into 2020. It didn't really happen, but still, I mean, he didn't put up all that bad of stats. 23 touchdowns and 8 interceptions is really not all that bad, along with 3,000 yards of offense. Yeah, he wasn't all that bad of a quarterback last season. They do return their top running back in Zach Charbonnet as well. That's going to be a big return. He had just over 750 yards with 11 touchdowns last season. And they also return their second running back in Hassan Haskins. Another big running back for this team with 660 yards with 4 touchdowns. They also return their top receiver in Ronnie Bell. And for whichever quarterback that's going to take over from Michigan next season, which, I mean, I'd expect it to be Dylan McCaffrey. I mean, he definitely has got potential, I think, to be the best quarterback for Michigan next season, and I expect him to start. But if they do have Dylan McCaffrey at quarterback, that's going to be huge for him to be able to have an experienced receiver with Ronnie Bell in there. So that's going to be big for this team in general. Ronnie Bell last season, of course, once again, he was the best receiver on this team. And he had just right around 760 yards with a touchdown last season. And they also returned their second wide receiver in Nico Collins, which he was another big part of this team last season. He had just right around the same amount of yardage that Ronnie Bell did, as he had just right around 730 yards with 7 touchdowns last season. So, yeah, both of those receivers were really big for this team last season for sure. They do lose their third wide receiver in Donovan Peoples-Jones, which he had 430 yards with 6 touchdowns last season. So, yeah, he put up some decent yardage as well last season. Nothing much in comparison to Ronnie Bell or Nico Collins, but still, he did have an impact on this team. The thing is that really concerns me for Michigan, though. I mean, the receivers and the running backs and, even Dylan McCaffrey at quarterback all looks really good to me, but it's the offensive line that's really taken a couple of really bad losses. They lose 3 on the offensive line, and they also lose 3 linebackers with 2 in the secondary. So this linebacking core is taking a major hit. I mean, the defensive line looks good, but as far as the defense goes, other than that, this defense could take a little bit of a decline going into 2020. And that's another reason. I mean, Michigan, they just had all of the keys to be able to have a great season in 2019. And I'm sure it's very, very disappointing for this team in general to do as well as they did. I mean, 9-4, trust me, that's not all that bad of a record. And that is not a bad season. But living up to the expectations that Michigan had last season, I mean, this is a team that was 9-3 in the regular season. They could have easily done some big damage, I think, in the Big Ten. If they could, I mean, they could have easily done that. But they do also have a decent recruiting class coming in, so that's going to help a ton. But chances of winning the Big Ten East this season, I mean, it's tough to say right now. We're still pretty early on, and it's tough to predict these things, especially when you've got as tough of a division as the Big Ten East is this season. I mean, if you look at this Big Ten East, you got already Penn State and Ohio State And then you can't forget about schools like Indiana, and you also got Michigan State in there. It's just going to be a tough division next season. And I think for Michigan, it wouldn't surprise me a single bit to see them be in the top 3. It's just tough for me to say that they'll beat out both Ohio State and Penn State to win the division next season. I mean, anything can happen. We've seen some crazy things in the past happen with that division, but I think that Michigan next season, I mean, I'd say it's not impossible that they win the division, but I think their chances are much lower than they were going into last season, at least. I mean, their chances of winning the division last season, I would have said, are probably 1-4. I mean, Michigan definitely would have been one of my favorites to win that division last season. But as far as this season goes, with Shea Patterson not being in there, I mean, once again, I still have got a lot of faith in Dylan McCaffrey. But then again, we still haven't seen him play hardly at all, so it's tough to say. But still, for Michigan, this is going to be a good team, and I don't think they're good enough to win the Big Ten East next season. How big of an impact will losing Shea Patterson have next season? Once again, I mean, as I said before, Shea Patterson was a good quarterback, but he was not great by any means. I mean, his completion rate was pretty low last season at a 56%. That's pretty low in comparison to most quarterbacks, especially in the Big Ten. So for Shea Patterson, I mean, yeah, he had a lot to improve on over his career. But I think for Dylan McCaffrey, of course, once again, we have hardly even seen him play. I mean, the only stats that we have on him last season are 116 yards and a touchdown. He only threw 20 passes last season, and I mean, he didn't have much playing time in 2018 as well. I mean, he had just 126 yards in 2018 too. So, I mean, yeah, he really doesn't have a lot of experience, but I do have a lot of optimism for him, and I think he could definitely surprise a lot of people going into next season. But nonetheless, looking at your schedule for next season, you start off the season with a really tough one against Washington in Seattle on September 5th, and that's going to be a very important game for both sides. Of course, Washington and Michigan are kind of in the same ballpark as far as talent goes. I mean, especially for Washington, they're losing their great quarterback with Jacob Eason going into next season, so that does concern me with them a little bit. But Michigan, at the same time, I mean, they're losing quite a bit of talent as well. So, I mean, for both teams, that honestly is a toss-up game for me. I mean, I feel like Michigan, being in the better conference, would easily give me the favorite, easily make me think Michigan could get a win there. But then again, I mean, with it being on the road, it just makes it so much tougher. But nonetheless, you got Ball State and Arkansas State after those two games, two easier ones there. Then you got your first Big Ten test against Wisconsin, and you got Penn State the week after that. And then you got Michigan State, Minnesota, and Purdue in 3 consecutive weeks. You got a bye week, then you play Maryland at home, followed by Rutgers, Indiana, and Ohio State. So as far as it looks right now, I'd assume your toughest month will be October, or that month between Wisconsin and Minnesota. I mean, those 4 games right in through there are all going to be tough ones, especially having the tough ones against Minnesota on the road and Michigan State. You can make up an argument for that too. But here's what I'm expecting out of your September. I think you go 4-0 through September, which is going to be huge for Michigan. I mean, once again, you got 2 tough games in there with Washington and Wisconsin. I think you get a win against Washington. Many people are expecting Washington to get a win there, and I think that's definitely reasonable. I mean, Washington's a team that is pretty good at home, and I mean, they've also got a decent amount of talent. And with it being the first game of the season too, you can easily make an argument that Washington should win that game. But I'm going to give Michigan the win there. I think Michigan all around next season will have more talent. I think for Washington, I mean, if you look at the better quarterback from last season between Jacob Eason for Washington and Shea Patterson for Michigan, just to be honest with you, Jacob Eason was the better quarterback, and so that means it's going to have to be a bigger adjustment for Washington going into next season. And I think with that, Washington are on their first game without Jacob Eason. I think Michigan kind of takes advantage of that, and they get the win there. As far as the Ball State and Arkansas State goes, don't even worry about those. I think both of them are going to be easy wins. That Wisconsin game is going to be a close one. That one was tough to predict as well. I mean, I think Wisconsin in general could be at the same level or better than Michigan next season. It's just tough to say right now, but I'd say Wisconsin definitely comes in and makes it a close game. But I think Michigan being at home really gives them the advantage there, and I think Michigan gets the win over Wisconsin. Plus, I mean, in the past, if you've looked at the past few seasons, Michigan has had a lot of success against Wisconsin, so that's why I think Michigan gets the win there. And as far as October goes, this is where I think things get a little bit bumpy. I think you get a great win against Penn State as well. So you have 2 really good wins in 2 consecutive weeks against Wisconsin and Penn State. Honestly, I'd assume after those first 5 games, Michigan coming into that Michigan State game 5-0, I'd assume Michigan will probably be ranked in the top 15, maybe even top 10. I I mean, probably top 10 to be honest with you, considering Wisconsin and Penn State will likely be ranked pretty high up at that point in the season that Michigan plays them. But I think that Michigan goes into that Michigan State game with a pretty high ranking, but I just think those two road games, after playing two brutal home games against Wisconsin and Penn State, I think Michigan kind of goes into those two road games against Michigan State and Minnesota kind of burnt out a little bit. I think Michigan State gets the win there on October 10th. And that Minnesota game in general is going to be really tough. I mean, Tanner Morgan and that team should easily be able to have a good chance to win the West Division next season. And I think, for Minnesota, Minnesota's a team in general that surprised a lot of people last season. So, it's possible that they do fall off next season. But, once again, I still expect they're returning their top quarterback and a lot of talent on that team. I think Minnesota gets the win there. I also think Michigan State, as much as Michigan fans are going to want to win that one, coming off of two really tough games against Wisconsin and Penn State, once again, that just does not set up well to get a win against Michigan State. this schedule is really just a rough setup for Michigan. If you have Purdue in between the Michigan State and Minnesota games, or in between the Wisconsin, Penn State, and Michigan State, Minnesota games, I think that definitely Michigan could get a win against Michigan State. But once again, the schedule just does not set up well for Michigan to be able to get a couple wins there. So you come into your November with a 6-2 record, you're already bowl eligible, and I think you blow through your first three games in November with Maryland, Rutgers, and Indiana. And that Ohio State game, I know Michigan fans and everyone wants to beat Ohio State. That's the big goal for Michigan this season, I'm sure. But Ohio State, until Michigan beats Ohio State, there is no reason for me to predict that Michigan will beat Ohio State. Michigan hasn't beaten Ohio State in forever. And I think Ohio State in general next season is going to be a team that should be in the top three for the majority of the season. It wouldn't surprise me to see them be in front of Clemson for a few weeks just because of how much talent that team has with Justin Fields, and that offense is going to be great next season. And Michigan, I think they'll keep it close in that game against Ohio State and Columbus. But once again, until Michigan is able to beat Ohio State, I just don't see a reason to believe that Michigan will beat Ohio State, if you know what I mean. But with that, your record prediction for Michigan next season will be 9-3. This is a team, once again, that I still think has a lot of potential to possibly have a 10-win season. And I think that, they've got the talent there to do that. But I just think the schedule does not set up very well for them to get to 10 wins. If you had Michigan State and Minnesota perhaps in the early parts of November, I think you could easily get a win at least against Michigan State. That Minnesota one would still be tough, but once again, you could go either way with that. But nonetheless, I think your September looks really good with Washington and Wisconsin, and then that Penn State game in October. I think that Michigan probably is going to be the favorite team for me to win those three games, without doubt. But with that about wraps up our preview on Michigan for the 2020 season. And if you enjoyed this preview, be sure to slap a like on it and subscribe as well. It really helps out the channel, and I'd really appreciate that. But as always, be sure to stay tuned for more content from All Sports Central. Let me know your thoughts on Michigan in the comments below. Stay tuned for more. I will see you all later.